You were talking about Zsa Zsa Gabor earlier. And
everybody's talking
my
about
son said, she was on Johnny Carson's show one time. She came there with a cat on her lap, and she said to you, "Do you want to pet my?" Is it true?
No, I think I would recall that.
There's a moment in television history that people still argue about today. A moment so charged, so uncomfortable, and so perfectly captured on tape that it became a measuring stick for every difficult guest who ever sat across from Johnny Carson. And when you ask the people who were there, who studied the show, who pored over the tapes and the memories, the answer almost always circles back to the same name. Not a villain, not someone with a criminal record or a history of public meltdowns. Just a woman who walked onto that stage with total confidence, complete disregard for anyone else in the room, and an agenda that had nothing to do with being a good guest. But before we get to her, we need to understand the world she walked into. Because Johnny Carson was not simply a television host. He was the most powerful man in American entertainment for 3 straight decades. From the moment he took over The Tonight Show in October 1962, he built something that was less a talk show and more a nightly audition for the American dream. If Carson liked you, your career exploded. If he turned cold, doors closed quietly and permanently. Producers across Hollywood watched his body language the way traders watch market indexes. A raised eyebrow from Carson could mean more than 1,000 reviews in 1,000 newspapers. He ran that show like a precise machine, and at the center of that machine was a simple social contract. You come on, you play by the rules, you respect the host, you respect the crew, and you walk away with your career intact and your reputation boosted. Most guests understood this intuitively. They arrived prepared, they stayed in their lane, and they left grateful. But some guests either did not understand the contract or simply did not care. And those are the stories that history preserved like flies in amber. Carson himself was not an easy man. People who knew him well, who spent years in that building on Burbank, described someone who existed in 2 completely separate worlds. On camera, he was the warmest man alive. Loose, funny, generous with his reactions, capable of making a nervous comedian feel like the only person in the universe worth talking to. Off camera, the temperature dropped. His second wife once compared the experience of living with him to sharing a house with a tiger. His third wife admitted there were nights she was genuinely frightened. Carson himself went on national television and told the country that alcohol turned him into a different person entirely. And he said it without flinching, which tells you he had made a kind of peace with the truth, even if he had not entirely conquered it. That duality mattered because it shaped how he responded to people who crossed him. When someone offended Carson, they did not usually get a confrontation. They got silence. They got removal. He kept a mental list, and according to longtime producer Peter Lassley, that list eventually had more than 30 names on it. Some people claim they saw a physical copy. Some bans were total and permanent. Others were surgical, applying only to episodes Carson himself hosted, while allowing the offending guest to return when someone else sat behind the desk. It sounds like a small distinction until you realize that being banned from Carson meant being banned from the most watched program in late-night television, which meant being invisible to the biggest audience in America. The ban list included people who had been rude to crew members. It included people who had corrected him on air. It included people who had deceived him. Jerry Lewis was removed after verbally abusing a cardholder. Carl Sagan was frozen out after correcting Carson twice during a conversation about Halley's Comet. Orson Welles was banned after using planted audience members during a magic segment, which Carson considered a fundamental act of dishonesty. The magician in him could not forgive that kind of cheating. And then there were the guests who crossed the line simply by being too much of themselves, too loud, too self-interested, too unwilling to share the room. Which brings us back to the question of who was the most difficult guest Carson ever faced. And the honest answer is complicated because difficult takes different shapes. There is the guest who is hostile. There is the guest who is unprepared. There is the guest who makes the room uncomfortable through behavior that no amount of professional grace can neutralize. And then there's a category all its own, the guest who hijacks the entire enterprise and turns it into something it was never meant to be. Zsa Zsa Gabor belongs in that last category, and the evidence is overwhelming. When Carson took The Tonight Show to Hollywood for the first time on May 15th, 1963, the guest lineup was genuinely extraordinary. Marlon Brando was there. Zsa Zsa was there. The room should have crackled with electricity in the best possible way. Instead, it produced one of the most documented and most analyzed confrontations in Carson's entire 30-year career. Brando arrived looking loose, warm, and slightly unsteady in that particular way that very famous people sometimes allow themselves to be in rooms where they feel comfortable. He sat beside Gabor, and the conversation began pleasantly enough. He even complimented her, calling her fascinating, which was exactly the kind of generous opener that sets a good segment in motion. But Gabor had not come to have conversation. She had come to sell face cream. Specifically, a beauty product she had recently attached her name to, and she was not going to let anything as trivial as the rhythm of a television program get between her and her promotional goals. Every question Carson asked found its way back to the cream. Every topic Brando raised somehow curved back toward her skincare line. She was relentless in the way that only someone with complete social confidence can be relentless, without embarrassment, without apology, without the slightest acknowledgement that she was doing anything unusual. The audience began to feel it. The crew began to feel it. And Brando, a man not famous for his patience or his tolerance for nonsense, began to feel it most of all. When Brando told a weak joke and received polite applause, the kind audiences give when they love the person more than the material, Gabor made her move. She turned to the room and said that only for Marlon Brando would they applaud for something like that. It was precise and devastating in the particular way that a remark can be devastating when it tells a true thing at exactly the wrong moment. Brando's composure snapped. He looked at her and asked, with considerable force, whether they were going to sit there all night listening to her promotional plugs. The word he used was not plugs exactly, but the meaning was clear and the delivery was not gentle. From that point, the segment deteriorated rapidly. Accounts from people who were present describe insults flying in both directions, the conversation losing whatever professional scaffolding had been holding it up, and Carson caught in the middle between two enormous personalities, each of them accustomed to being the most important person in any room, neither of them willing to yield. Gabor eventually stood up, gathered herself with full theatrical dignity, and walked off the set. Brando remained his chair with something close to a smile, apparently quite satisfied with how things had turned out. What is remarkable about this story is not just the confrontation itself, but what it reveals about how Gabor operated in public spaces. She was, in the truest sense, a pioneer of a particular kind of celebrity, famous not primarily for a body of work, but for the sheer force of her personality and the relentless management of her own image. She had been married 9 times. She called everyone darling. She understood instinctively that attention was the currency that mattered, and she collected it aggressively. Coming on to Carson's show was not, for her, an opportunity to be part of a conversation. It was a platform, and she intended to use it as such. The extraordinary thing is that Carson never banned her. Despite the chaos of that May 1963 appearance, despite the friction and the fallen segment and the stormed exit, Gabor kept coming back. She appeared again in April 1963, then October 1964, then May 1965, then June 1965, then February 1966, then May 1967. Carson kept inviting her, and she kept accepting, and that particular dynamic says something important about how Carson understood television. He could be annoyed. He could be frustrated. But he also recognized when someone, even at their most impossible, made the screen come alive. Gabor made the screen come alive. She always had. But the Gabor story opens a larger question about what makes a guest truly difficult, and the answer involves more than just a single incident. The guests who earned the deepest and most permanent places on Carson's list were not always the ones who caused the most visible chaos in a single appearance. Sometimes the most serious offenses were the quieter ones, the ones that happened in green rooms and phone calls and decisions made far from the studio floor. Joan Rivers made 185 appearances on The Tonight Show over more than 2 decades. She was the first woman Carson ever named as a permanent guest host. She turned down other network offers out of loyalty to him and to the show. On screen, they had the kind of chemistry that makes audiences lean forward, the warm, easy rhythm of two people who genuinely enjoy each other's company. Off-screen, Rivers later admitted, they barely knew each other at all. When a camera stopped, the warmth mostly stopped with them. Polite small talk, pencil drumming, long silences. When Fox offered Rivers her own late-night show in 1986, the decision made complete financial sense. The offer was roughly 15 times what she was making at NBC. Her husband would be employed as executive producer. The network was new and hungry and ready to build around her. She took the deal, and in doing so, she cracked something in Carson that never fully healed. The argument over who knew what and when became one of the longest-running disputes in television history. Rivers said she called Carson first, and he slammed the phone down twice. Carson's team said he found out from NBC president Brandon Tartikoff and watched the announcement on television feeling blindsided and humiliated. The truth, as it usually does, probably lives somewhere in the gap between those two versions. What is clear is that Carson experienced the whole thing as a betrayal of the deepest kind, not because she left. Producer Peter Lassily said Carson would have given her his blessing if she had come to him honestly during negotiations and told him about the offer. The unforgivable part in Carson's worldview was the secrecy, the sense that she had been hiding her intentions, making her plans in the dark, and only surfacing with the news once it was already done and irreversible. After that, Carson never spoke to Rivers again. Not in a room, not on the phone, not in any form for the remaining 19 years of his life.